This is just a quick video to go over how to attach the wires to the LED strip if you do need to reattach wires to the ends. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a fresh section. You can see that this one here has some solder on it. That does make it a little bit easier, but I'm going to start with a brand new fresh section. Now when you cut these, I recommend using some really sharp cutters and cutting a little bit into the bit that you're cutting off, just so that you've got a little bit of extra copper to solder onto. So I'm not going to cut right on the line, I'm going to cut just a smidgen over the line. As you can see there, I'm just a little bit over the line, and then cut that off. The next thing you want to do is we want to prepare this to solder the new wires on. So what I normally do is I just peel up a little bit of this sticky section on the back, and then I just sit it down, stick it to whatever surface that I'm working on. If I do get annoyed with this sitting up, I'll sometimes sit my pliers on top of there. Now you can see I haven't cut this very straight. That's not very good of me, so I'm just going to fix that up very quickly before we move on. Lovely. Now generally when I peel the sticky off, I try not to go too far beyond this first light here, because when we put some heat shrink on at the end, then we're going to cover this part up anyway. So let's just stick this back down. I'm just going to place something on here so it doesn't move around. The next part we need is our wires. Now these wires are unstripped at the moment. I've just cut them straight across. I like to use these fancy strippers. If you want to do it your own way, that's fine. And just take a small amount off at the end. Now you don't have to use what I'm about to use, so you don't have to use flux. Flux makes it really easy to solder. This is soldering flux. I like to use a little bit of it just because it makes everything much nicer. So I'm just going to dip my little wires into the end there and just get a little bit of flux on the end. I don't know if you can see that very well, but that's good to go. Now with my solder, I'm just going to put a little bit of solder onto these wires first, just so that they attach nice and easily without heating everything up too much in the end. So if I put a little bit of solder on my soldering iron, then I just put that onto the wires. I normally just give it a couple little brushes on both sides and then clean my soldering iron. So you'll see now that these are now nice and straight. With these 3-pin ones, you'll see that the pins don't quite line up. So I will bend these out slightly. So bend that one out and bend this one out slightly, just so that then when I go to solder it, it fits on there nice and neat. My hands are filthy at the moment. I've been soldering for quite a while today, so apologies for that. The next thing I'll do is I'll get a little bit of solder ready on the LED strip. So what I do is we just heat up the soldering pad and just drop a little dob of solder on there like that. And I just go along and do that on each of the pads. It's very important to heat the pad up and then feed the solder in, and just put a little bit into each. Now we should have enough solder between what we've just put on the pad and what's on these cables to get a really nice solder connection. So what I do first is I want to line everything up. So I just want to make sure that I've folded these wires out enough. If you want, you can separate the cables, but I prefer just to leave them all together. And always making sure that our positive 12 volts is lined up with the red wire, or whatever colour wire you're using for positive. So once I've got everything lined up like this, super simple to solder it together. We just touch the soldering iron on the top of the wire until we see that it joins together. Do that in the middle one, touch it on the top of the wire, and touch it on the top of the wire. Now one thing that I've noticed here is that there's not quite enough solder. I don't know if I can zoom in a little bit here. But you see how you can see the wires sticking up out of the soldering joint? What I'm going to do to that is just add a little bit more solder to each one. So if I just get my soldering iron, just add a little bit more solder. What you want to see is a nice blob. You don't want to see the shape of the wires that you're attaching anymore. If you do one at a time, they're not going to move around. Once all that's done, what I like to do then is just get a little bit of, this is 12mm heat shrink, and slide that up, over and onto the connection point. Try not to make it too long. If you make it too long, then you won't be able to bend this wire properly when you're trying to mount it inside your extrusion or wherever you're mounting it to. So before, when we peeled this up, this is really important to do this before you put the heat shrink on, as what will happen if you put the heat shrink over the top of this tape, you're never going to be able to peel that tape up. You're going to have to get a knife out and cut it, and it's not a great experience. So it is okay to put the heat shrink over the top of the first resistor there, as long as you're not going over the top of the first LED. Then if you've got a heat gun, use a heat gun. I've got a little heat gun here. Should be around 130, 140 degrees. I sometimes have mine a little bit hotter to speed things up. But if you've got it too hot, especially when you're using white heat shrink, you'll notice that you turn your heat shrink black. So try not to heat up the solder so that the solder melts, otherwise you're going to have issues with connection. And that's all done. So that's a brand new end on the end of some addressable pixel LED strip.